wanted to share a quick thought with you in anticipation of Shavuos coming up. Seems to be an appropriate chag for people who are connected with Livnos College for Women. Just want to point out that the views expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the administration of Livnos College for Women, but I just want to share with you, I think it's appropriate, a particular idea for Shavuos that kind of frames and it clarifies what it is that we're trying to do in all these classes, all these courses that we offer. I think it's important to remember that Livnos is not conceived as some kind of a project for feminists. Nobody's trying to make a point here. What Livnos College for Women is trying to do is to, well, not to introduce anything new. It's to return, right? There are no radical innovations here. Nobody's trying to preside over a revolution. It's a return. It's a return to the classic way of being, the way Jewish women have been throughout all of history. Let me try to prove that, to illustrate that, and then we'll talk a little bit more. The Maharsha to Masechta Sota. The Maharsha is one of the earliest Achronim. His commentary appears, you'll see it in the back of the Gemaras, the standard Gemaras, because it's fundamental to be able to learn the Maharsha. The Maharsha, we ascribe an infallibility to, obviously, to the Tanoim, to the Amoraim, to the Rishonim, and the Maharsha, although he appears, he's the first generation of Achronim, he enjoys that same kind of reverence. If the Maharsha says something, it's right. It's right. You might not be able to see it at first glance, but if you spend enough time, you'll see the absolute truth of what he's saying. So in that light, let's look at a statement the Maharsha makes. In Masechta Sota, so his comments, these are his comments to Chaf Aleph, to Daf Chaf Aleph, Amud Aleph. So there's a pasuk that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, he says to him, Ko Tomar Levet Yaakov. This, right? Well, let me finish the pasuk. V'tagid Livnei Yisrael. At first glance, it seems that this is one of those, the way very often biblical sentences, verses, quotes are constructed. There's a certain kind of parallelism. It's thus shall you do this and you shall do this. Either comparisons, parallels, or contrasts. So if you were to look at it, you think, oh, this is a very poetic formulation, right? Ko tomar leveit Yaakov. Thus shall you speak to Beit Yaakov. V'tagid livnei Yisrael. And you shall say to Bnei Yisrael. So in fact, Chazal tell us that there's a little bit more going on. It's not just a poetic kind of repetition. There are two distinct activities taking place here, described in this pasuk. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is charging Moshe to do two very distinct actions. The first, Ko Tomar Levet Yaakov. Thus shall you say, you shall say to Beit Yaakov. V'tagid Livnei Yisrael. And also, in addition, V'tagid Livnei Yisrael, you shall tell Bnei Yisrael. So Chazal tell us by now, this point, this particular Chazal, I bet you all know. You're familiar with it. Beit Yaakov, Elu Hanashim. These are the women. And Bnei Yisrael, those are the men. So when we talk about the Beis Yaakov movement, all those wonderful institutions out there, Beis Yaakov derives its name from here, Elu Hanashim. So we could look at it, we'd say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, Ko Tomar, when you have to teach Torah, Tomar Leveit Yaakov. You should say it to the women. And V'tagid Livnei Yisrael, and you shall say it to the men, to Bnei Yisrael. That in and of itself is pretty powerful. No one's trying to avoid or to ignore the women's education. In fact, if you look at the pasuk, it's stated first. Ko tomar leveit Yaakov. You shall say this. You should instruct, tell it to the women. V'tagid Livnei Yisrael, and tell it to the men. So we can look and say, oh, that's pretty important. By the way, to be fair, the Medrash continues and it says, Kidei sheyiyu manhigot et bneihem laTorah. The special importance of telling it to the women, to Beit Yaakov, is that then they're going to instruct their children. And in fact, the Maharsha says, well, you see that in the pasuk. And this is the Maharsha's careful reading of the pasuk. He says, Ko tomar leveit Yaakov, yesh lomar lanashim, shekol echat mehen, teach the women, so that every one of them will then turn around, v'tagid livnei Yisrael, and then she will tell it to the Jewish people. They'll direct, they'll guide their children in the way of the Torah. Because chinuch is given over to the mothers. So in fact, what we see here, this clever reading, is if you're familiar with different grammatical forms in Hebrew. So tagid could be the second person command form. You shall say, oh Moshe, you shall say, la'agid, you shall say to Bnei Yisrael. But the Maharsha tells us that that's not, because the fact is there's a different verb form. It's the third person feminine. So it's either the second person command form masculine, or it's the third person future tense feminine. So kotomar levet Yaakov, thus shall you say to the Jewish women, v'tagid, and then she, in the feminine, in other words, they, the Jewish women in Mas, will turn around, v'tagid levnei Yisrael, and they will tell the men. According to this read, we're not talking about a parallelism in the sense of two distinct actions. Oh, Moshe, tell the women. Oh, tell the women we're going to celebrate the women's role in chinuch, in raising the generations of the Jewish people. That's why we say the pasuk, we say them first, we mention them first. And then the next action, Moshe, v'tagid levnei Yisrael, and you shall tell this, and thus shall you say to the men. That's two distinct actions. Moshe initiating both of those. He's involved in the tomar. He's involved in the tagid. You could read it that way, but the Maharsha tells us that's not to read it. There's one action. Moshe Rabbeinu was charged with one action and one action only. Teach the women. Teach the women. And then they will turn around and they'll teach the next generation of the Jewish people, of all the men, all those budding Torah scholars. Now, that is a very powerful idea. And what we see from this is that, and we see our common everyday experience and our life experience bears this out. It confirms it very, very powerfully. Certain things, you can argue about certain things. These are truths, immutable truths that we have seen over the long course of history. We know that whatever Rebbeim will do later on, whatever they're going to teach their Talmidim, they're building on a foundation that was established in the home, and it was established by the mother. If you think about the kind of exchanges that go on when children are small, when they're growing up, before that first day that a parent takes them by the hand and leads them to Gan and turns over perhaps some aspect of their chinuch to other people, by that time there have been countless conversations about all kinds of issues dealing with hashkafas haTorah, fundamental ikrei ha'emuna. Children ask all kinds of questions. Why is this? And how come Hashem this? And what's it all about? And they're asking questions. Their little brains, well, they're not. They're huge minds. They're huge intellects. They're curious. They're looking at the world. They're trying to understand how does everything work? This is their first encounter with reality. And they're curious and they give expression to those questions, and nothing is out of bounds. And they talk and they ask and they ask, and they direct those questions to the person who is with them all the time, their mothers. So they ask them about questions that have to do with hashkafas haTorah. There are all kinds of practical halachic situations that come up, and the mothers are instructing their children when it comes to halacha. And the children are being taught the rudiments of davening and of keeping a kosher kitchen and living a Torah life. All of those issues come up long before the child is heading off to the mir or to brisk. Long before that, they've had countless hours of conversations. Chazal acknowledge this. They have a term. They talk about girsa diyankusa. It's the learning that one does in one's childhood. And Chazal tell us that learning is the most enduring. It's the most enduring. Anything anyone does afterwards, they're building on a foundation. They're building on a foundation. Sometimes the Bali Musar, for example, discuss this, that we have to go against the Girsa Diyankusa because we learn things, certain topics, and just because we can't entertain the most sophisticated version, so we have to fight against that, but we have to try to refine it, to enhance it, to correct it, to shape it. That's true. That's true. But what we want What we want is that the absolute best fighting chance that we can have, that Girsa de Yankusa will be good, will be the absolute best that it can be, so that it's not that much of an issue. We can shape it and refine it, but we don't have to fight against it. God forbid, imagine we're taught ideas which are contrary to what Torah really says. So then that Girsa de Yankusa is a heavy burden. It's a curse that we carry around with us. Chazal are very clear. We don't want that. What we want is the absolute best fighting chance that someone can have. So that early childhood education has to be the absolute best. We don't want a distorted or ignorant or superficial or oversimplified version of Torah. We want distilled, the truth, distilled to remain the truth. That is quite a challenge, to distill without distorting. Pshat, we talk about pshat. Pshat is, it's not the simple, it's the straightforward meaning, because pshat, the straightforward meaning, can be quite sophisticated. We don't want simple or superficial presentations of Torah ideas. And if you think about it from the very beginning, we encounter, children ask questions, and we encounter opportunities, conversations in which it's so easy to step over, to fall off the edge by saying things, simple statements that are kfira. So if a mother were to say, if a child's talking and saying, oh, Hashem is so big, he's the biggest. No, we don't corporealize HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't attribute physical characteristics of dimensions and size and space and none of those concepts apply to us. None of them apply to Hashem. So a parent has to be very, very careful to sing the song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. It presents profound theological problems and contradictions to really what we really, really believe. That song, you have to avoid it. And a mother needs to be very, very sophisticated hashkafically and halachically to be able to know how to present ideas, to distill them into a very, very straightforward presentation without distorting. I once had the opportunity to witness, I eavesdropped, so to speak, on an Odom Godel, tremendous Talmud Chacham. He was in a certain context and he was representing the Jewish people in a gathering of non-Jews. There were a whole bunch of people there. And in order, lahagdil Torah ulahadira, to raise the prestige of Torah, he set over an idea from Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker, who was famous for creating the Brisker Derech. His comments, his explanations of the Rambam are extraordinarily deep and sophisticated. So I watched as this Torah giant said over Reb Chaim to a group of non-Jewish people. And I asked him about it afterwards, and he said, I wanted to raise the prestige. I wanted them to understand the profundity of Torah. And he said, you can even say over Reb Chaim to an Eno Yehudi. They have no Torah background. They have no ideas, no grounding, no framework, no context, nothing. He said, you can do it and you can capture the absolute truth of it. He said, if you have crystal clarity, if you have perfect clarity, you can do it. To be able to distill it to its absolute essential, fundamental core, he said, if you have perfect clarity, you can do it. How do you think Jewish women throughout the ages acquired and possessed and exercised this clarity? They had a minute exchange with their moms while they were making kreplach in the kitchen. We talk, sometimes people will raise this, they'll talk about the fact that Judaism doesn't respect women. So if you think about the fact, I can't think of a greater attribution of superhuman powers to a woman, to assume that what takes men hundreds, thousands of hours to acquire, understanding of Hashkafa Torah, to master, to plow through all kinds of svarim of Hashkafa and of Musar, and to understand Torah Shebichsav with clarity, to understand what its messages really are, and to just imagine that women have it automatically. They don't look inside, they don't study, they don't learn, but they just have it. It's not possible. It's not possible. And learning throughout the ages for women, education, Torah education, was much more than a momentary exchange with their moms over kreplach. It was much more than reading Tsena Urena, the Midrashim. David HaMelech talks about the fact that he singles out his mother. He describes her and the lessons that he learned from her. He was nursing from his mother. He was a baby and he was nursing, and she was already pouring into him the fundamental ideas of Torah. That's how you raise a David HaMelech. That's how you get a David HaMelech. It's not chinuch that takes place later on. For all of his life, his education was built on a foundation that his mother had given him. As he was nursing from her, he was also imbibing on the fundamentals of Torah. The Girsa de Yankusa, his Girsa de Yankusa came straight from his mother, and he possessed a crystal clarity because of that. Livnos is not an innovation. It's a return to the way learning has always been, to respect the fact that women need to learn and they need to have substantive, clear, accurate learning. It has to be built on within a framework of the correct Hashkafas HaTorah. You know, we acknowledge this on Shavuos. There's a custom, we eat dairy. When we eat dairy, the Mefarshim tell us, we are reminding ourselves that we return to a state, we remember what it was like to be children when we were nursing. And Torah education doesn't come so much from the Mir or from Brisk. It comes from the Girsa de Yankusa that we receive in childhood, when we're nursing at our earliest ages, when our mothers, Tagid lebnei Yisrael, when they're busy pouring in Torah to us, to have that kind of clarity, it sets us up, it positions us for success all the rest of our lives. When you're eating your dairy meal on Shavuos, think back and think to yourself, we're celebrating here the education, the Torah education, the crystal clear, accurate, substantive, profound Torah education that Jewish mothers have been giving to their children, raising the next generation throughout all of Jewish history, from the moment of Kabbalas HaTorah at Har Sinai. Have a wonderful Shavuos. Good luck receiving the Torah all over again. All the best. Bye-bye.